Hey, I'm glad you're here tonight. Before we start, take a moment to like this video and subscribe if you haven't already. It really helps, more than you think. Also, I'm always curious, where are you watching from right now? And what time is it for you? Midnight? Maybe closer to 3 a.m.? Let me know down in the comments. I love seeing where everyone's drifting off from. Now, if you're ready, close your eyes, settle in, and let's begin. Let's go back. Back to a time when the world slowed not because of choice, but because of death. A time when silence stretched over towns, not as peace, but as aftermath. The Black Death. You've heard of it. Maybe you know the numbers. Maybe you know the mask with the beak. Maybe you remember the rhyme ring around the rosy. But that's not the story. That's the surface. The real story is quieter, stranger, and far more haunting. It was not just about death, it was about decay. Of trust, of faith, of the self. The plague didn't just kill people, it unraveled how people thought the world worked. It mocked their gods. It laughed at medicine. It touched not just the poor or the sinful, but everyone. It arrived without warning and stayed far too long. And when it left, the world was not the same. But that's later. For now, imagine Europe. 14th century, fields, villages. Cats darting between cobblestones. A priest somewhere rings a bell. Children laugh, unaware. And somewhere beneath it all, something moves. Not quickly, not even visibly, but it moves. A ship docking with cargo from the east. Fleas inside fur. Rats inside grain. A breath. A cough. A shiver. That's how it starts. Not with screams, but with silence. The incubation is days, the fear immediate. People fall ill and swell. Boils appear, lymph nodes harden, skin darkens. The body becomes unfamiliar, and nothing helps. Not prayer, not bloodletting, not leeches, not even distance. And so, they begin to burn things, clothes, beds, entire homes. Sometimes even the sick. Not out of cruelty but fear. You see, it wasn't just death they feared. It was contagion. The idea that being near someone could kill you. And not in weeks, but in hours. So they ran. They fled cities. They hid. They closed churches, doors, windows. They stopped touching, stopped gathering. Mothers avoided their own children. Lovers kept distance. And still it spread. Because the plague didn't need permission. It clung to breath, to rats, to cloth. It found the weak, the healthy, the noble, the nameless. No one was immune. And in this dark hush, something else began to grow blame. They blamed the wind, the stars, the Jews, the poor, the rich, the strangers. They blamed themselves. Flagellants roamed, whipping their own backs, begging God to end it. Doctors wore masks shaped like birds, hoping herbs in the beak would filter the air. Priests died mid-sermon. Entire monasteries emptied. And outside, the bells kept ringing. Not to call the faithful, but to mark the dead. One bell for each body. In some towns, the bells never stopped. Graves filled, then mass graves, then pits. The earth opened to take them, and still, it wasn't enough. The smell stayed, the silence too. And in that silence, the world changed. Not instantly, not all at once, but something inside the human mind shifted. If God could not save them, who could? If no one was safe, what mattered? Traditions collapsed. Art turned darker. Wills were rewritten in panic. Children stopped playing in the streets. Markets closed. Animals wandered free. Time felt different. Slower. Thicker. As if the air was holding its breath. The Black Death did not just take lives. It changed how time felt, how love felt, how food tasted. And after it passed, no one was the same. But the plague wasn't finished. Not yet. This is just the beginning. The first whisper of something enormous. Something that would stretch across continents, across years. Something that would visit again, and again, and again. But that's for later. For now, rest. We'll drift deeper soon. Into the cities. The bodies. The strange beauty of what survived. Into the quiet rooms where history curled up in grief and waited to be remembered. But not now. For now, let the bells fade, let the wind settle, let the plague sleep, and let you sleep too. There were no sirens, no announcements, no systems in place. When the plague reached a town, it didn't ask for permission. It arrived on a breeze, in a barrel, in the fur of a rat. It simply appeared, like a shadow behind your shoulder that you didn't know was there until it moved. And when it did, everything changed. Streets once filled with chatter and barter became hollow. Stalls left unattended. Apples browning in the sun. Dogs sniffing at shutters that no longer opened. You could walk an entire block and hear only wind. Maybe a cough. Maybe nothing. The silence became a character, a presence, something alive. It wasn't the kind of silence that brings calm. It was heavy, slow, like breath held too long. You began to listen differently. For footsteps, for wheezing, for the sound of bells that meant another body had been taken. Families boarded up homes, not to protect against thieves, but to keep death out or sometimes in. Some lit fires inside, hoping smoke would drive out the bad air. Some held flowers beneath their noses. Roses, lavender, anything with a scent strong enough to cover rot. People wore charms, swallowed crushed emeralds, bled themselves, whispered prayers in forgotten Latin. Nothing helped. The boil would come anyway. First, as a lump beneath the armpit, or in the groin, or behind the ear. Then fever, delirium, sometimes vomiting, sometimes blackened fingers. Then silence. The body would cool, the skin would settle, and someone, if anyone was left, would carry it out. Or not. Sometimes the bodies stayed. In beds, on floors, in chairs, until someone noticed the smell, or the flies, or the rats. And then, if you were lucky, the bell would ring. The body collectors would come, hoods up, faces masked. They moved like ghosts. No eye contact, no speaking, just a cart, a lifting, a sheet, a prayer, if there was time, then gone. And the street would return to silence. Some began to mark their doors. A red cross, a ribbon, a sign, not as warning, but resignation. Others fled to the countryside, thinking fields would save them. But the rats traveled too. The fleas didn't care if it was city or forest. So the fear followed. And in the fear, people changed. Neighbors stopped being neighbors. Doors stayed shut. Food became harder to find. Money became meaningless. What use was silver when the baker was dead? The cobbler? The priest? What good were coins when no one would take them from your trembling hand? So people bartered. Bread for cloth. Wine for medicine. Or they stole. From the sick, from the dead, from anyone. Morality softened. Rules blurred. Who could blame a child for stealing bread when his parents were gone? Who could blame a man for taking a ring from a corpse if it meant another day of survival? And in this decay of order, new customs formed. People stopped burying properly. There wasn't time or space. They dug trenches, lined them with lime, stacked the bodies, covered them, moved on. Sometimes the same trench would reopen days later for more. It was not cruelty. It was necessity. But even in this horror, humans clung to fragments of ritual, a flower placed in a dead hand, a whispered name, a carved mark on a wall, some memory that someone had lived, that they weren't just numbers, but memory too began to fail. Dates blurred, time stretched. Some said it was a punishment from God. Others believed it was the end of days. Some stopped speaking. Some started screaming. But most just sat, waiting, listening, watching the world fold in. There were no heroes, no great victories, just survival. And even that was not triumph. It was endurance, a slow, quiet ache that you carried like a bruise. Because the plague didn't just kill the body, it bruised the soul. It taught people to flinch at touch, to fear breath, to doubt kindness. That's what made it worse than you think. Not the death, but the silence that came after it. The way the world felt unfamiliar. Not because of what was missing, but because of what remained. You, Awake, alone, breathing, wondering if that too was a symptom. But for now, you're safe. You're here, far from the carts, the bells, the silence, far from the eyes of strangers behind boarded windows. Just breathe. Let the fog of history surround you. Let the fear recede. Let the stories slow. There's more to tell, but not yet. Not tonight. The plague sleeps for now. And you should too. When the last bell had rung, and the last cart rolled away, and the last pit was closed over the last body, the world did not celebrate. There was no victory, only stillness. The kind of stillness that settles after a storm that did not spare you. A hush that lingers not out of peace, but out of exhaustion. Towns reopened their gates. Fields were tilled again. Markets, once empty, began to see slow movement. But it was never the same. Something had shifted deeply, permanently. You could see it in the way people moved, slower, more distant. In the way they spoke, with fewer words. In the way children played, with less laughter. Something had been taken, and no one was sure how to get it back. The church had no answers. It had prayed, it had wept, it had buried. And yet, it had died too. Entire orders of monks had vanished. Bishops, priests, nuns. The faithful had looked upward for salvation, and the sky had remained silent. So some turned away, others turned inward, mystics. Visions. A rise in private devotion. Religion didn't disappear, it changed shape, became more personal, more desperate. A crucifix beside the bed. A candle burned, not in ritual, but in hope. And the art changed too. Before, it had been filled with saints and halos and golden light. After, it was different. Skeletons began to ants across tapestries. Skulls sat at the base of altars. The dance macabre dance was painted in churches, showing death waltzing with kings and paupers alike. A reminder that no one had been spared, that no one ever would be again. Literature turned darker. Poetry mourned the world. Even lullabies carried warnings. And medicine, once ruled by balance and humors, began to shift. Slowly, reluctantly, people began to suspect that perhaps it wasn't bad air, or sin, or imbalance, that maybe something else was at work. It would take centuries more to understand germs, but the doubt had begun. The seed had been planted, and in the space left by death, change took root. Laborers were suddenly scarce. Fields needed hands, so wages rose. Serfs began to walk away, demanded more, and sometimes they got it. Entire social systems, once fixed, began to crack. Because death had made everyone equal, even if only for a moment. Nobles had died just like farmers, priests like bakers. The old hierarchies had trembled, not collapsed, not yet, but trembled. And that was enough to begin a new thought. What if the world could be different? What if it didn't have to return to how it was? Some wanted that. Others feared it. But either way, the thought was there. And thoughts, once released, don't vanish. They drift. They settle. They grow. Cities rebuilt, but they left space. Wider streets, cleaner wells. Laws were passed for sanitation, for quarantine, for records. Because the memory of the plague remained. Not just in the pages of chronicles, but in behavior, in dreams, in the small choices made each day. Wash your hands. Don't get too close. Cover your mouth. They didn't understand why, but they remembered the fear, and fear is a powerful teacher. So is grief. Grief that doesn't wail, that doesn't scream, but sits quietly, follows you, becomes part of you. That's what the Black Death left behind. Not just numbers, not just pits, but a new kind of silence. One that echoed into the Renaissance, into Enlightenment, into now. You may not hear it, but it's there. In the gap between laughter and hesitation. In the way we fear touch during illness. In the way we trace symptoms with our eyes. In how we mourn. Quietly. Alone. That's the shadow it cast. Long. Cold, familiar, but tonight we've walked far enough. Let the bells stay still, let the paintings dry, let the whispers of plague fade into the fog. We'll continue our journey soon, into deeper layers of history, but not now. Now is for rest, for silence, for letting the story sleep inside you, soft and heavy like an old blanket. You're safe, you're warm, and the Black Death is far away. For now, they didn't write books, they didn't leave statues, they didn't command armies, but they lived through it, or didn't. The peasants, the bakers, the washerwomen, the children with calloused feet and candle wax on their fingers. They carried buckets, kneaded dough, hauled firewood, sang hymns they barely understood, and when the plague came, they died quietly, or waited quietly to die. Their stories were not written in ink, but in habits, in passed-down phrases, in the way a grandmother might glance at a bruise and say, "Softly, cover that." These were the ones closest to the earth, to the bodies, to the blood. The nuns in the convents who bathed the sick, whispered prayers while holding hands that twitched in fever, buried sisters in shared cloth because the shrouds had run out. They did not cry loudly. There wasn't time or permission. One nun wrote in a corner of a wall behind a wooden panel, "My sisters die. I clean their faces. I forget my own." That panel was never meant to be found, but centuries later, it was. The ink faded, the wood dry, the words still there. Then there was Thomas, a miller's apprentice, too young to understand what was happening. He watched his master grow pale, watched his wife wail and then fall silent, and then watched the door stay closed. Days passed. No flour was ground. No bread was baked. Thomas, hungry and shivering, wandered into the next village. No one was there, or at least, no one answered. He wrote no diary, left no letter, but the mill records stopped with his name, and the wheel never turned again. In another town, far from Thomas, a woman named Cecily kept her mother's scarf soaked in vinegar and herbs. She held it to her face while tending the sick. She believed it protected her. It didn't. She died in a hayloft beside two of her children. The third survived, barely, and passed the scarf down to her daughter. It became an heirloom, worn not for faith, but for memory. No one remembered Cecily's voice, but they remembered the way she smelled of lavender and fear. Across the sea, in a coastal port, a man named Jakob sealed his home when the fever came, nailed the windows, locked the doors, fed his family pickled fish and root vegetables. For weeks, no one left. Then his daughter coughed. Then his wife. Then Jacob sat beside them both, holding their hands, whispering lullabies between sobs. When the door was finally opened, weeks later, all were gone, but someone had carved a heart into the table. Just that, a heart. No name, no message, but it said everything. These were the stories that weren't told, because they weren't dramatic, they weren't heroic, but they were real. They were the air of that time, the breath that fogged the windows, the warmth that faded too fast. In every village, someone sang to keep the dark away. In every home, someone lit a candle and watched it burn too quickly. And even though we do not have their names, we have their echoes, in lullabies, in kitchen harps. In the way silence sometimes falls in the middle of a crowded room, that silence carries them. The ones who boiled water again and again, hoping to purify a world that could not be cleaned. The ones who whispered, "Stay awake," to each other, and then watched the other slip into a fevered sleep they would never wake from. These were the people who didn't understand what was happening but still endured it. Not because they were strong, but because they had no choice. And in that quiet endurance, they gave us something. A lineage not of blood, but of breath. A reminder that even when the world tilts, someone keeps stirring the soup. Someone holds the hand. Someone carves the heart. Tonight, as you rest, know that they're there. Not in ghost stories, but in the way the wind moves through an old window, in the way your breath slows when you hear a lullaby you don't quite remember, in the stillness between thoughts. Their world ended. Ours did not. But maybe, just maybe, some part of them survived in us. And maybe, when the air grows heavy and the light dim, They're the ones who tell us, softly, to rest, to let go, to sleep, because they did. And the world turned again. Just a little slower, just a little softer. They called it bad air. They called it punishment. They called it the hand of God, or the devil, or something nameless crawling through the fields at dusk. They called it a judgment. And in the absence of answers, they made their own. Doors were painted with ash. Coins were boiled in vinegar. Some people carried herbs wrapped in linen and clutched them like shields. Rosemary, lavender, wormwood. They burned them in basins, letting the smoke twist through the rafters. Others wore masks filled with perfume-splagued doctors in bird-like beaks, not to frighten, but to filter. A scent to ward off rot. A symbol of fragile hope. In kitchens, garlic was strung in knots and hung above soup pots. Children were taught not to sing too loud, not to whistle after dark, not to dream of crows. There were rules, spoken and unspoken. If a cat looked at you too long, it was a sign. If your right ear itched, someone you loved was dying. If the well water was too clear, it meant the spirits had touched it. They whispered these things, not because they believed them entirely, but because not whispering felt like an invitation. Some drew circles of chalk around their beds. Others placed iron nails beneath their pillows. A mother buried a silver comb under her child's cradle, hoping it would confuse the fever. A baker refused to sweep before sunset, fearing it would stir the sickness. And when the moon turned red, which it often did through smoke and dust, they said it was an omen. That night, prayers doubled. Lamps burned longer. Dogs were not allowed indoors. In monasteries, monks copied protective psalms over and over until their fingers blistered. On the walls of taverns, marks were carved symbols known only to those who believed. A forked line meant safe bread. A looped spiral warned of coughing. These codes changed from village to village, but they existed, spreading like roots beneath the surface of daily life. There were dances to rituals of motion to chase away the sickness. Some barefoot in the mud, others in silence, arms crossed. A form of prayer, a defiance of stillness. In the fields, scarecrows were dressed in Sunday clothes, not to frighten birds, but to remind the plague that these lands were already claimed. That death was not welcome here, and sometimes it worked, or seemed to. A family would survive, a town would recover, and the ritual became tradition. A girl named Ellen wore a necklace of feathers for 3 winters, never removing it, believing it protected her breath. Her brother died, her sister died, but she did not. She kept the feathers until they rotted, and even after, she tied the string around her wrist. When she was old, she gave it to her granddaughter, told her it was nothing, but also everything. Stories like this linger. They were not written in books, but they were remembered in the way fingers trace doorframes, in the way people pause before lighting a candle, in the hushed songs sung to sleeping children. Ring around the rosy, a pocket full of posies. Ashes, ashes. We all fall down. It sounds like nonsense, but it isn't. It's memory disguised as rhyme, a rhythm to make the unbearable bearable. Even now, those who study these things argue, did the rhyme come later? Was it really about the plague? But does it matter? The fear is in the cadence, the silence after the last line, the breath caught before a child laughs. Because that's how the past survives softly beneath the noise, through habits. Through warnings we no longer question. Don't walk barefoot outside. Don't sleep with your hair wet. Don't open the windows after sunset. Some of it is nonsense, but some of it isn't. Some of it is inheritance, not of blood, but of caution. And when you feel it, that sudden pause, that shiver without cause, that's where it lives. In the space between logic and memory, in the tension behind closed eyes. The Middle Ages did not invent fear, but they lived with it, wove it into daily life, hung it from rafters, stirred it into soup, tied it in ribbons, painted it above the door. Not because they were superstitious fools, but because they were human, because they were desperate, because it gave shape to what had none. Tonight, as you rest, think of them. The ones who slept with cloves beneath their tongues, who whispered charms before entering the cellar, who marked the wind with salt, not for magic, not always, but for comfort. And comfort, even imagined, can be powerful. Let it be that way for you now. Let the whispers fade. Let the cymbals sleep. Let the walls stand silent and the wind pass without omen. You are safe. You are held. You are far from the fields. Far from the fever. The only breath you need to listen to tonight is your own. Steady, slow, soft. We'll go further soon. But not yet. Not now. Now, just sleep. They didn't rebuild the same way. After the silence, after the smoke, after the weeping ended, or simply ran out. Villages rose again, but not quite as they were. The roads widened, not for carriages, but for coffins. Houses grew farther apart, as if trying to forget how close death had pressed against the walls. Churches added windows, not for light, but for air-thin slits, to let breath escape. Cemeteries grew outward, then upward, then layered. Bones beneath bones, names beneath names. It became common to reuse graves, to speak of resting places with a kind of shrug. A priest once wrote, "We bury the dead not with dignity, but with speed." And still people prayed, but softer, slower. The Latin chants took on a new weight. Each syllable stretched. Each amen clung to the rafters like mist. Children were taught different lullabies, not the ones with bright meadows and birdsong, but those with stars that blinked and vanished, wolves that circled, and winds that took names. In the kitchens, women stirred broths and whispered over the steam, not spells, not always, but something close, a way to claim control. Even the clothing changed, darker cloth, longer sleeves, hoods that shadowed faces. Buttons not for fashion, but for closure physical and emotional. Gloves, even in summer. Handkerchiefs pressed with oil. The body was to be hidden, cleaned, contained. This was not modesty. It was memory. The memory of rot, of swelling, of skin that darkened too quickly, and the perfumes myrrh, rosewater, camphor, not for vanity, for protection, against smell, against fear, against recall. Art shifted too. Gone were the tapestries of courtly love, the angels with golden hair. In their place, dancing skeletons, the dance macabre, a parade of the dead, cloaked, grinning, inviting. No one was spared. Kings held hands with peasants. Bishops danced with beggars, a reminder that the grave made equals of us all. These images hung in town halls, above altars, in cloisters, not as warnings, as reflections. People no longer feared death. They expected it. They dressed it. They drew it. They made it part of the room. A guest at every meal. A shadow in every doorway. And in that acceptance, there was strange peace. A woman named Agnes painted skulls in the corners of her manuscripts. Tiny, barely visible. Tucked between saints and scrolls. She called them her reminders. She lived to be 64. A rare age, and still she painted the bones, even as her own became fragile. A blacksmith named Harn kept a tally on his wall marks for every customer he'd lost. At first, it was daily, then weekly, then monthly. He never erased them. When he died, his apprentice added one more, and wrote beneath it, "May the hammers stay quiet for a while." Schools changed too. Less Latin, more local tongue. Priests began to preach in the language of the people. Death had made them closer, had broken the walls of mystery, had taught that clarity mattered more than grandeur, that comfort mattered more than power, that kindness, even simple kindness, could be sacred. A candle lit, a loaf shared, a hand held, even if gloved. And in homes, people began to keep journals, quiet ones. Not grand treatises, just notes. Anna laughed today. The cough is gone. Snow fell early. Fragments of survival, anchors in time. Proof that life continued, that it could continue, that it deserved to be remembered. And in those notes, we find the soul of that era. Not in wars, not in crowns, but in the quiet record of breathing, of enduring, of refusing to forget. So tonight, as you lie in the dark, think of them, not as ghosts, not as victims, but as survivors, as authors of a new way to be, a way that valued small comforts, that honored breath, that made room for silence. The world didn't end. It changed, and so did we. Let that change wrap around you now, like a wool cloak against the cold, like a lullaby without words, like a prayer that doesn't ask, but only listens. Rest now. Drift. The darkness holds no malice, only memory. They had always believed in balance. 4 humors. 4 fluids inside the body: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile. Health was the harmony between them. Illness was imbalance. And the plague, they said, was imbalance made visible. A flood of black bile, a surge of corrupted air. So they bled. They burned herbs. They cut to release what they couldn't see. A barber surgeon might take your pulse, nod solemnly, and open your vein without a word, letting the sickness flow out, drop by drop, into a shallow dish. They'd press leeches to skin, wrap bodies in warm cloth soaked in vinegar, press poultices of onion and mustard to the armpits, hoping to draw the fever down. And sometimes, very rarely, it worked, or seemed to. A child survived, a wound closed, a cough faded. And that was enough. Enough to keep believing. In wooden boxes lined with wool, they stored dried toads, bat wings, stones with holes in the center. Each had a purpose. Each had a name. These weren't just oddities. They were hopes in physical form. Objects to hold against the unknown. In monasteries, healers turned pages of ancient texts: Galen, Hippocrates, Avicenna. Their fingers smudged the margins, searching for patterns, but the plague didn't obey patterns. It arrived when it wanted, stayed as long as it pleased, took without reason. And so healers began to write new texts, observations, charts, what worked, what didn't. A monk in York noted that singing psalms while bathing the feet helped ease breathing. A midwife in Ghent wrote that rose honey soothed the throat if taken before the 3rd day of coughing. A soldier-turned-herbalist claimed that rubbing nettles along the spine restored strength to the legs. Not all of it was true, but it was effort. It was attention. And attention, in a world that had once been deaf to suffering, was a revolution. Women began to teach each other, quietly, in kitchens, in gardens. Recipes passed hand to hand, spoken between prayers. Mugwort for bleeding, elderberry for chills, yarrow for cuts. They didn't call it medicine, they called it care. And sometimes that made all the difference. Meanwhile, in cities, apothecaries rose in number. Shelves filled with vials, labeled in Latin and local tongue, for sleep, for bile, for grief. Yes, grief had medicine. Mixtures of lavender and mint, sometimes with wine, to numb, to soften, to allow breath to return. Because grief was everywhere. In the streets, in the beds, in the bread left uneaten. Some healers began to paint diagrams. The body spread open like a map, lines tracing nerves, arrows pointing to pain, hearts drawn like fruit, lungs like branches. A visual language for a silent struggle. These were not accurate, but they were intimate. And intimacy, in healing, mattered more than precision. For the dying, there were rituals. Hands washed with spring water, eyelids closed with coins, psalms whispered into ears that no longer heard, and still they whispered. Because the act itself mattered. Because kindness wasn't for the living alone. A woman named Hildred stitched small bags of time into her husband's shroud. She said it was to keep him warm on the other side. No one argued. A boy named Tomas placed his dog's collar beneath his sister's pillow. He said it would help her find him if she woke up lost. This was medicine too, of a kind, a healing of the soul, a way to cradle sorrow. And over time, these practices grew, merged, shifted. The sharp became gentle, The harsh softened. People began to listen more, to speak less. And in that silence, in that space between breath and word, a new understanding took root. That healing was not always a cure, that sometimes it was presence. A hand held, a song hummed, a candle lit at dusk. So tonight, let yourself rest in that presence. You don't need remedies, you don't need cures, just stillness, just softness, just this moment. Let your breath settle. Let the fear loosen its grip. You are not a patient. You are not a problem to be solved. You are a story being carried forward, slowly, gently, with care. They didn't mean to start a revolution. They only wanted answers. When the prayers stopped working, when the saints stayed silent, some turned to patterns. A merchant named Leoric began recording who died and when. He made charts, not of names, but of days. And he noticed. The deaths came faster in the south wind. A baker's wife in Rouen marked her wall with chalk X for fever, O for cough. When her chalk ran out, she used ash. When the ash blurred, she started again, and through the blur, she saw it. People who ate from a certain Wellmore died. So she stopped drawing and started warning. Not that well, she'd whisper, and others listened. A monk named Elric, once devoted to copying psalms, began writing symptoms instead. Not for prayer, for memory, swelling under the arms. Purple blotches, breathing shallow by day 3. He wrote it all. His margins were no longer filled with saints, but with records. He didn't know why he wrote, only that someone should. And centuries later, we found those pages. The beginnings of epidemiology, hidden in ink and habit. In Milan, they began locking homes. Not from cruelty, but from observation. They saw that sickness spread. They didn't know the word contagion, but they saw it leap from one bed to the next. And so, they shut doors. Painted marks, left food at windows. Some lived, some didn't. But patterns emerged. In Venice, ships waited at sea. 40 days. 40 giorni. The birth of quarantine. Not science, not yet. But something close, a pause, a breath held, a hope that distance could be safety. And in Paris, scholars debated the air. Was it poisoned, corrupted by stars? They argued, not in whispers, but in letters. Treatises passed from cloister to court. Some blamed the Jews, others the cats. Some said the earth itself was sick, but others, fewer, quieter, said, look again. They watched the rats, the fleas, the grain sacks. They saw that plague did not come from sin but from the world's small, hidden mechanics. In that observation, science stirred. Slowly. Not with answers, but with better questions. What makes a person fall ill? Why do some survive? What is the body, really? Beneath the robes and rosaries? Anatomy became more than curiosity. It became necessity. A doctor named Hubert drew what he saw. Not angels, not demons, but lungs like withered sacks, buboes blackened and split. He called his sketches evidence. He was mocked, but he kept drawing. And over time, others drew too, not from imagination, from experience. And medicine began to shift. Less bloodletting, more waiting. Less prayer, more notes. They called it studying. It was a fragile hope, but it grew. Hospitals changed, from places of dying to places of trying. Beds were numbered, windows added, water boiled. Clean sheets became a ritual. A new kind of cleanliness, a new kind of care. People still died, but they died watched, counted, remembered, and sometimes rarely they lived. And those moments mattered. A girl survived. A man walked again. A cough eased. A fever broke. And someone wrote it down. Medicine, in those moments, became more than mystery. It became memory. A shared remembering of what helped, what harmed, what healed. And in that remembering, a future was shaped. So tonight, remember this. Even in the darkest chapters, curiosity flickers. In the shadow of plague, someone always asks, why? And in that asking, we move forward. Not quickly, not cleanly, but steadily. Let that comfort you now. As you rest, as you drift, you are part of a long chain of questions, of seekers, of soft, stubborn light. Let your breath join theirs. Let your sleep carry their hope. They didn't know what they had started, but the change had begun. It crept, like fog through alleys. Not loud, not swift, but present. After the worst had passed, after the bells fell silent and the plague carts stopped rolling, something remained. A question, a need, a quiet refusal to forget. They began to speak of health in new terms, not divine favor, not luck, but care, clean air, clear water, gentle hands. In some towns they built new wells, deeper, lined with stone. They planted trees in the center of squares, not for beauty, for breath. And slowly, cities changed shape. Streets widened, waste cleared more often, walls painted white. These weren't just improvements, they were rituals, responses to memory. Echoes of loss turned into habits of prevention. Schools reopened, but alongside scripture, they taught herbs, anatomy, observation. Children learned that lungs could fail, that fever had patterns, that the world could be cruel, yes, but also comprehensible. A woman named Bruna, once a weaver, began teaching girls how to grind roots into powder, how to feel the pulse, how to listen not just to the chest, but to the silence behind it. She called it listening for ghosts. Others called it medicine. And in some places, doctors became listeners, not just tellers. They asked questions. Where did it hurt? How long? What did the dream say? Dreams mattered. Grief had shape. Sorrow left marks. And those marks too needed tending. Art changed. No longer just saints in gold leaf, but bodies. Real ones. Bent. Broken. Breathing. A sculptor in Florence carved a statue of a woman holding her dying child. No angels, just hands, just skin. It was called Mercy. It stood for decades before it crumbled, but its shape lived on. In memory, in muscle, in how people knelt beside the sick. Religion didn't vanish, but it softened. The wrath of God made room for the compassion of saints. Priests washed feet. Monks carried wood. The sacred became service. And in that service, a new kind of faith was born. Not of fear, but of presence. To stay when others fled. To sing when others wept. To touch when others recoiled. And those choices, small as they seemed, rewrote the world. The Black Death had not ended humanity. It had revealed it in its rawest, most desperate form. And from that exposure, something tender emerged. Not stronger, not pure, but more awake. A woman lighting a candle at dusk. A man mending a stranger's roof. A child drawing lungs in chalk. Small things, quiet things, but real. And real, in a world once drowned in silence, was everything. So as you drift now, remember this. The worst passed. It always does. And what remains is what we build in its wake, not just memory, but meaning. Let that be your comfort. Let that be your breath. Let that be the stillness you carry forward. You are not alone. You are part of the after, part of what comes next, part of the healing the world doesn't always see, but always needs. Breathe with that. Sleep with that, and let morning find you softer. They never meant to break the system, they only wanted to survive. But when the carts stopped rolling and the plague flags fell, the world was no longer the same. The fields stood silent, wheat unharvested, grapes unpicked. Oxen waited for hands that never came. And slowly, painfully, it became clear. There were fewer people. Fewer to obey, fewer to kneel, fewer to serve. A lord in Lincolnshire stood on the steps of his manor, looking out at his land and saw no one. His reeve was dead, his steward gone. The cottages around the estate were quiet, chimneys cold, doors ajar. The wind carried no laughter, no barking dogs, no rhythm of tools, just stillness. And in that stillness, the power drained from his ringed hand, like sand from a broken hourglass. A woman named Sabiya, once a servant, returned to her village and found it half gone, her brother's house empty, the fields near her father's orchard overgrown. She walked to the manor, expecting scorn, but the gates were open, the kitchen door unlatched, and inside a note: "If you read this, cook something." The master had left, or died, or fled, and so she stayed, not as a guest, as the new beginning. In cities, merchants with no apprentices began training anyone with a pulse. Tailors taught farm boys, masons taught beggars. The rules of guilds bent, cracked, changed. A boy named Henri, once too poor to learn, became a candlemaker in Rouen because there was no one else, and his candles lit chapels for 30 years. The hierarchy softened, not because it was kind, because it had no choice. In Florence, a banker begged peasants to come till his garden. When they refused, he offered bread, then wool, then land. The peasants laughed. "You need us now," they said. And we remember. The balance tilted, just slightly, but it tilted. Some lords tried to hold it back, to fix wages, to forbid movement, to declare that nothing had changed. But it had, and no law could undo the silence they had heard. A silence in which they realized, without the people, the crown was just a circle of metal. Without the hands, the harvest was just wasted sun. And the people, those who had been beneath the system, were now beneath open skies, choosing where to walk. Entire villages moved. Families packed what little they had and left, for other towns, for freedom, for better pay. The world became more fluid, less obedient. And with that fluidity came fear. From those who once sat above, "They are forgetting their place," the nobles said. But the people had found something else: their worth. A laborer in Essex wrote a song. It had no name, just verses passed from mouth to mouth. "We plowed while they feasted, we bled while they drank, but now we walk taller, and they learn to thank." It was a lullaby, a protest, a seed. A monk in York refused to copy feudal documents, said the names meant nothing now. "The land remembers only the feet that walk it," he wrote, "not the ink that claims it." And his words, dismissed at the time, would be quoted centuries later. The plague had emptied homes, but it had filled minds, with questions, with memories, with value. For every life lost, another saw the world anew. And while power still clung to crowns and coats of arms, it now had to whisper, not roar. So as you rest now, breathe with that thought. Even the darkest upheavals shift the soil. And in that soil, new roots grow. You are not only part of the history that suffered, you are part of the history that rebuilt. Let that settle in your chest. Let that soften your thoughts. Let that be your nightlight as you drift. They thought cities would die with the people, but cities, like weeds, found cracks to grow in. And so, after the plague emptied the streets, something strange happened. Stalls opened again, slowly. A potter in Milan placed 2 bowls on a blanket near the church steps. No customers, just sunlight. Then a butcher passed by. "Trade?" he asked. "Meat for 1 bowl?" The potter nodded. That was the beginning, a market of shadows, of half-open shutters and cautious footsteps. But it grew, not from law, not from lords, from need. A woman named Leah, once a midwife, began selling herbs outside the convent wall. She crushed lavender, thyme, yarrow, for breath, she whispered to those who stopped. For grief. Her stall became a place of pause, of soft hands and silent tears. Coins were rare, so they traded. Wool for eggs, needles for bread, labor for a place by the fire. A baker in Bruges had no apprentices left. He taught 2 girls who had lost their father. They learned fast, and with each loaf, they added their names to a world that had not planned to include them. Women became vendors, healers, scribes. Not because anyone allowed it, because no one else was left, and the world adjusted. Unwillingly, but undeniably. In Ghent, a widow named Annika rented her husband's tools to blacksmiths who'd survived. She kept the ledger, balanced the rates. When questioned, she said, "The iron listens to me now." And no one argued. Small banks emerged. Not with marble halls, with benches, ledgers, trust. A young man named Ralph, once a cooper's son, began lending grain at fair rates. He wrote agreements by hand, folded them, tied them with ribbon. His neighbors called him the boy who fixed hunger. In port towns, trade resumed, slowly. Ships came with fewer sails, but with goods. Salt, spices, cloth. And they needed hands to unload. Boys too young before were now strong enough. Men too old before were now needed. Every role shifted. The cobbler cleaned fish. The mason sewed sacks. The priest stirred stew. And in that mingling, pride gave way to function. What mattered was not status, but usefulness. Paris reopened its bridges first, then its markets, then its music. In taverns, songs changed. They no longer praised kings. They named bakers, singers, survivors. One ballad went, "Her hands smelled of yeast, her eyes held the storm. She baked through the silence and fed the whole town. A song, a truth, a revolution." Even the guilds, once rigid, softened. Ed new members. Allowed new blood. A boy named Elias, born a serf, was accepted into the glassmakers' guild. He blew his first sphere with shaking lungs. It shimmered like morning frost. The master said, "You've captured sorrow." And they kept it on the shelf. Trade routes changed. Old paths were abandoned. New ones opened. The road from Bordeaux to Lyon, once a minor route, became vital. It passed through towns with fewer tolls, safer wells, better bread. And with every wagon that passed, the idea of center shifted. No longer only Rome, or Paris, or London, but places of survival, of cooperation, of breath. Even currency changed. Not just gold, but trust, reputation, kindness. A tailor named Bruni mended clothes for orphans. The bishop noticed, paid her in candles. "Light for warmth," he said. And those candles lit her shop for months. Night markets appeared, lantern lit, whisper soft. A woman hummed lullabies as she sold cheese. A man played a flute beside his fruit stand. Children danced, not for coin, for joy. They were not trying to return to the old world. They were building a new one transaction at a time, quiet, resilient, human. So as you drift now, picture them, the hands exchanging bread, the eyes meeting across counters, the coins passed with a nod. And remember, in the ashes of collapse, trade becomes more than economy. It becomes connection. You are part of that lineage. Not just of buyers or sellers, but of rebuilders, of breathers, of small, steady hope. Let that fill your chest. Let that soften your night. Let it remind you that even in loss, people choose to give, choose to craft, choose to keep going. Sleep in that knowing, that beneath all ruins, something always begins again. Before the plague, labor was a sentence, a chain, something assigned, inherited, endured. You did what your father did because your father had no choice, and neither did you. But when the world cracked, something slipped through those fractures. Choice. At first, small. A mason who stopped carving lions and tried birds instead. A seamstress who stitched patterns no one asked for, just to see them bloom. They didn't know what they were doing, only that it felt like breathing. In a town called Dreux, a boy named Thomas once carried stones. Day after day. After the plague, no one came to give him orders. So he sat by the pile, picked one up, and began to shape it not into a wall, but into a face. Then a second, then a third. Faces of those who were gone. He placed them near the well. People came, touched them, cried. No one paid him. But each day he returned and carved. In the silence that followed the deaths, there was space for new sounds. The scrape of chisel, not for defense, but for memory. The hum of song while weaving. not to pass the time, but to remember someone's voice. A young girl in Siena, left with her grandfather's tools, tried painting. At first, it was fruit, then faces, then stories. By the time she turned 16, a merchant asked her to paint his family. She wept not from pride, from disbelief. Her hands, once meant to sew in silence, now told stories, and people listened. Across towns, people began to write, not in Latin, in common tongues, in notebooks, on scraps, on walls. They wrote what they saw, what they felt. A man in Tournai, etched into wood. Today I baked again. The smell made me cry. That plank was nailed above his oven. His bread sold out each morning, not for flavor, for feeling. New professions emerged, not dictated, but discovered. A woman named Alex began gathering herbs near the river. She wrote what each did, tested them, shared them. She became known not as a witch, but a knower. Villagers brought her children, fevers, broken limbs. She treated them gently, and when asked what she charged, she said, "A song, a story, a stone for my garden." They brought all three, crafts deepened. A weaver in Lubeck made cloth with a pattern no one had seen. Spirals, like seashells. I dreamed them, he said. The cloth sold to a traveler who brought it to another town, and so dreams moved. From loom to shoulder to story. The meaning of work shifted. It was still hard, still daily, still filled with cold mornings and sore fingers. But now, it had soul. And that changed everything. Even the rich, those who survived, began to notice. They commissioned not just walls but colors, not just robes but symbols. A noblewoman asked for a tapestry of her lost daughters. The weaver cried as she worked. "I did not know them," she said, "but now I do." The noblewoman touched the thread. So do I. In churches, choirs sang softer songs, not grand, not thunderous. Songs that remembered, songs that forgave. And in between prayers, some priests taught villagers to read, to write, to wonder. It wasn't everywhere, not always, but it was enough. Enough to say, something had changed. The world was still wounded, but in that wound, people placed seeds of meaning, of care, of time spent with intention. And so if your eyes are heavy now, let them rest in that thought. That work is not always weight. Sometimes it is warmth. You are part of that thread, that careful stitch in the dark, that silent carving at dawn. Let that hum in your chest. Let that be your rhythm as you sleep. They stopped ringing bells, not because they forgot, but because the bells rang too often. Each toll was a name, a home, a silence left behind. And when the bells never stopped, the silence became unbearable. So they rang no more, and people began to mourn differently. A girl named Thalia, in a hill village, whispered the names of her sisters into a row of pebbles. Each morning she turned one over. "Still with me," she said. A shepherd in the valley carved a tiny lamb for every friend he'd lost. He placed them in the rafters above his bed. "So they look down," he whispered. "So they see, I remember." Memory became architecture. In the absence of graves, people built shrines. Simple. A ribbon tied to a door. A bundle of rosemary in a window. A song hummed on the same path each dusk. And death, once distant, became intimate. Not an end, but a presence. A shadow in the room that didn't frighten, only watched. They began speaking to the dead, not as ghosts, as companions. "You'd laugh at this stew," a woman murmured, stirring a pot. "I still burn the onions." She smiled, alone, but not. Priests began to soften their sermons. They no longer thundered, they sighed. They spoke of mercy more than judgment, of reunion more than punishment. One said, "Heaven may be crowded now, but love makes space." And people believed, or wanted to. In monasteries, monks wrote new prayers, not for safety, for memory. "Let this name remain," one wrote. "Let it echo where breath has ended." That prayer was copied, whispered, passed, A child in Naples recited it at dusk. She didn't know Latin, but she knew loss. She knew hope. And the stars blinked quietly above. Cemeteries filled fast. Too fast, so hills became holy. Forests, streams. A mother scattered her son's ashes into a river. He liked the sound, she said. And from that day, the village called that bend in the water Luca's turn. Some painted. Walls once bare bloomed with faces, eyes closed, lips smiling. Above hearths, in cellars, in barns. Images not of saints, of siblings, friends, grandparents. The gone became visual, present, watched over, watched with. In Lion, a boy drew his father's boots every week. Different colors, different styles. He walked everywhere, he said. Now I help him keep going. Death did not leave, but it changed shape. It became quieter, more woven into life. A girl sat each evening at the edge of a field. She spoke to her brother. Today I saw a fox. It ran like you. She smiled, and the wind moved through the grass like a reply. Philosophy shifted. Scholars, once focused on glory, turned toward grief. What remains? One asked. Not marble, not gold, names and breath, kindness passed down, a song remembered. That scholar lit a candle each dusk for his students lost, and he read their notes aloud, not for correction, for continuation. Even dreams became gentler. People spoke of visits, of touches. My mother stood at the door, a woman whispered. She looked young again. She didn't speak, just nodded. The woman wept as she woke. That was enough. Morning became ritual, not with robes, with repetition. A cup placed just so, a scarf worn every Monday, a meal cooked the same way. He liked cumin, said an old man, seasoning soup, so I never forget. The lines between now and before blurred, and in that blur, comfort grew. The gone were not unreachable, just invisible. So if your eyes are closing now, let this soothe you. Every goodbye was also a tether, every tear a link. You carry more than memory. You carry presence. You are not alone in your grief. The past walks with you, and if you listen softly, you might hear it hum. They didn't have galleries. They had walls, wood, cloth, stone, but they painted anyway. They stitched. They carved. Not for beauty, for memory, for connection. In the aftermath of the plague, art seeped into places it had never been. On the inside of pantry doors, on barn beams, on the undersides of benches. A woman named Isabeau embroidered the sleeves of her children's old tunics, each with symbols only she understood. A sunflower for Emile, who laughed in summer. A star for Luc, who dreamed of the sky. She kept them folded in a chest, and each winter she opened them, touched the threads, and whispered their names. A young man in Brabant carved walking sticks, not just for balance, but as stories. One had a bird in flight. Another, a tower with 3 windows. Each figure had meaning. This one is for my grandfather, he said. He told stories about a girl in a tower. So now, the story walks with me. Paint became prayer. In Siena, a girl painted a scene on her cellar wall. It showed a table, full of bread and apples, and 7 figures sitting around either tea family. Every night, she sat across from it and said, "Good night." And the shadows from her lantern made them flicker, like breath. Poetry returned, not in books, in margins, on scraps. A baker scratched lines into flour bags. Today, I kneaded with aching arms, but I smelled your laugh in the crust. He tied that bag with care and placed it on the shelf. A widow in York kept a journal, not of thoughts, of phrases her husband used to say. Fold the cup from the bottom. Don't trust a rooster after sunset. The stars don't judge. She read them aloud each Sunday. That way, she said, he keeps talking. Music changed too. Flutes were gentler. Songs were slower. People sang in pairs, in corners, in empty chapels. Not to perform, to soothe. A boy with no parents played the same tune every morning as the sun rose. They hear it, he said. They know I woke up again. And perhaps they did. Dreams shifted. People began drawing them. Not grand symbols, simple things. A hand holding another, a gate opening, a child with a crown made of leaves. In Prague, a woman sketched her dreams into the margins of her Bible. She called them her night parables. One showed a cat curled next to a candle, another, a staircase vanishing into mist. "I don't know what they mean," she said, "but they help me breathe." Children began to paint with berry juice, with mud, with chalky stones. They drew faces with tears and then erased them with their palms. "Gone now," one boy said. "But they were here. These were not masterpieces, but they mattered." Because in a world emptied of so many, to create even something small was an act of defiance. A way of saying, "I remember. I hurt, but I still have hands." In a small village near Ghent, the church ceiling was blank. After the plague, a few survivors climbed up and painted stars. Dozens of them. One for each name they could remember. Each night, the priest looked up and whispered, "You are above us still." Even writing changed. Quills moved slower, words softened. People wrote fewer whys and more "I miss yous." Letters were buried under trees, folded into flowers, given to wind. A woman who lost her mother wrote her a letter every week. She left them on her windowsill. One night, a storm took them all. "She has them now," she whispered. Art also became teaching. A boy taught his neighbors to draw fishes. Father had been a fisherman. A girl taught others how to braid cords into patterns. Her sister once did the same. "If we pass it on," she said, "they don't fade." Rituals emerged. A circle of stones, a braid of hair, a certain way of walking home. In Brittany, families would eat in silence once a month, leaving one chair empty. "For those who can't sit," they'd say. It became a tradition. No one skipped it. In this sea of expression, even silence became meaningful. A candle lit without comment. A glance held a second longer. A breath shared at the door. The plague had taken voices, but in return, it had revealed the spaces where they once were. And in those spaces, people placed color. Thread, wood, ink, not to forget, to remember differently. So if your body is heavy now, and your thoughts drift to faces you miss, know this: they live in the ways you move, in the tune you hum, in the shape you trace on your sleeve when no one's watching. Creation is remembering, quietly, softly, without pressure. Let that truth cradle you now. Let it hold your breath and your rest. There came a point when grief was no longer sharp. It softened, like a stone worn by water. It didn't disappear, but it changed texture. People woke up and no longer gasped. They stirred their porridge without crying. They washed their hands not to forget, but to begin again. A boy in Venice planted flowers where his brother used to play. At first, it was one, then another. By autumn, there were 12. "He liked blue," he said, touching the petals. "Now this corner remembers." In the north, a woman began baking again. Her husband had loved her bread. She hadn't touched the oven in months. One day, without fanfare, she kneaded the dough, folded, waited, baked, and when the crust cracked, she smiled. "He would have said it's too soft," she whispered. And that was enough, not joy, but warmth. Morning became embedded, in habits, in tastes, in footsteps. A shepherd always paused at the hill where his daughter waved each morning. He stood there now, still waving, just in case. Some began to laugh again, quietly, almost apologetically, but laughter returned. It didn't erase the past. It danced with it. A cobbler told jokes as he stitched boots. "My son used to groan at this one," he said. "So I keep telling it." His neighbors didn't always laugh, but they listened. Listening was the new reverence. Not just to stories, to silence, to sighs between sentences, to the pauses that used to feel awkward. Now they felt sacred. A monk in Florence stopped writing theology. He began copying names, just names, in long, careful lines. "If I write them," he said, "they remain." He filled dozens of pages, No commentary, just presence. And when asked if it helped, he said, "They don't disappear if I don't let them." People began to mark time differently, not by seasons, by memories. "That was the year of the yellow bird," said one. "The year Mama forgot her shawl," said another. "The year we saw stars, even through tears." Time became personal, kind. A man in Catalonia wore his late wife's scarf every Sunday. "She liked this day," he said, "so I bring her with me." He didn't cry. He didn't explain. He just walked slowly, letting the scarf catch wind. In households, people began lighting candles at random hours. No feast day, no ritual, just because. "I thought of him," said one woman. "So I lit the dark." Light became memory. A teacher began ending each lesson with a story. Not from a book, from a life. "Today," she said, "I remember the baker who gave free bread the day the bells stopped." And the children listened, wide-eyed. They didn't ask why. They just knew it mattered. Children who had no memory of the plague learned to speak in remembrance. They drew butterflies for the ant they never met. They asked about the names carved in doorframes. Was he kind? One girl asked about a name. Her grandmother nodded. Very. That was enough. Kindness became legacy. More than riches, more than fame, people began to value gentle gestures, a cup placed beside a tired hand. A song hummed as shoes were mended. A chair pulled closer to the fire. These became the new monuments. Not tall, but enduring. In one village, they painted a wall white and asked everyone to leave a mark. A handprint, a line, a name. Over time, it became a mural, not beautiful, but honest. This is what we remember, they said. This is what remains. And in the quietest corners, people began speaking aloud to those they missed. Not in desperation, in routine. "I wore the red one," a man said to his empty kitchen. "You always said it made me brave." He smiled, took a spoonful of soup. "It's too salty. You were right." He chuckled. The chair across from him stayed empty, but not unnoticed. As the years passed, grief became part of the architecture. It wasn't removed. It was built around, like a tree growing around a fence, shaping itself, holding and held. And in this shape, there was room for others, for stories, for songs, for new names. So if you're lying there now with a name on your heart, know this: they are not gone. They are folded into your voice, into your walk, into the way you tuck your blanket at night. Absence is not emptiness. It is space made sacred. And if your breath is steady now, if your eyes begin to close, let them rest on this thought. Nothing truly loved is ever lost. It simply changes form and walks beside us, quietly, forever. When the bodies stopped piling, the orders began. Not for mourning, for control. Those who held landlords, bishops, merchants with enough silver feared not just death anymore. They feared change. The plague had shifted everything. Laborers were fewer. Fields lay fallow. Bread was scarcer. And those who survived knew it. For a brief, flickering moment, peasants realized they were needed, desperately. And power doesn't like desperation from below. So the laws came, not to help, to bind. "You must work," they said, "for the wage we set, no more." And if a man refused, he was branded. If a woman asked for more, she was shamed. "The dead are quiet," said one lord. "Let the living be silent too." Wages were frozen. Mobility restricted. Men who once wandered to find work were chained to villages by decree. One edict read, "None shall leave the parish where they dwell without writ." Another, "If a laborer demands more than his due, let him be placed in the stocks." These weren't laws of justice. They were laws of fear. The rich feared losing control. The church feared losing tithe. And so, even as graves were still soft, the noose tightened. A woman in Suffolk tried to leave her village to care for her sister in another town. She was stopped at the gate. "Your place is here," the guard said, "even if hers is the grave." A young man in Burgundy was offered twice the wage in a nearby manor. He went. When he returned, his cottage was burned. For disobedience, they said. He slept under trees after that. Hunger returned not from lack, but from hoarding. Those with barns locked them. Those with mills taxed more. A farmer with surplus wheat fed only his kin. The world is cruel, he said, so I must be crueler. And cruelty grew. In court records, new crimes appeared. Asking for bread without permission. Carrying seeds across boundaries. Speaking against the tax. One boy was whipped for teaching others to read a decree. Let knowledge remain with the clergy, said the bishop, and silence with the rest. Even in the cities where wealth pooled, rules thickened. Bells rang not to mourn, but to summon. Come account for your roof. Come register your sons. Come pay for the water you drew. And if you didn't come, they came for you. Punishment became public again. Stocks in the square. Whippings at crossroads. Names posted on church doors. Shame returned as a weapon. In one village, a girl who stole turnips was paraded barefoot for a mile. Her father wept. She was hungry, he said, and I was too proud to beg. In another, an old woman was accused of witchcraft not because she cursed, but because her garden still grew. No one survives alone, the neighbors said, unless they bargain with death. And so she was taken. Power, in fear, lashes out. And in this fear, it grows louder, more severe, more righteous. A noble in Castile declared, only by order can we rebuild. But the order he meant was not balance, it was obedience. In Paris, a law was passed. No gatherings of more than 4 without a priest present, lest rebellion be born, it said. In Cologne, a new tax was imposed for burying the dead, to remind the living who still owns the land. But even as these rules spread, cracks formed, quiet ones. A woman in Flanders sewed messages into tunics. You are not alone. A priest in York copied verses into the margins of hymnals. The meek shall not always kneel. A boy in Prague taught others to read not in halls, but in stables, in candlelight. These were whispers, but whispers carry, even beneath boots, even through iron, even inside fear. And while the lords built walls, while the bishops printed warnings, while the wealthy tightened locks, some peasants began to look not just at the soil, but at each other. If we need each other, said one man, why bow? He said it softly. Then again, and again, it began, as many things do, not with a bang, but with a whisper. A baker in Ghent began kneading extra loaves before sunrise. He left them at the edge of town. No name, no payment, just bread. When asked why, he said nothing. But people began waiting there. Silent lines, no questions, just need. In the fields, a boy started replanting rows not marked for his lord. Just a patch, hidden between stones. For later, he said, for us. A woman in Normandy offered warm soup to a passing stranger. Eat, she said, then walk. He did, and later returned with 2 others. They repaired her roof in silence. Nothing was written, nothing announced, but a current moved. In the villages where fear had once glued mouths shut, words returned in murmurs. Why not share? Why not help? Why not care for our own? These weren't rebellions, they were reminders. In one town, a group of widows met weekly not to cry, but to plan. Who needed shoes? Who had extra herbs? Who could still stitch, even with a shaking hand? They called themselves nothing, but they became everything. A blacksmith in Bavaria sharpened tools at night and left them on doorsteps. For the harvest, he said, if asked. A teacher in Milan taught numbers to children under trees. I lost my own, she said. These are now mine. Quiet acts became louder than any decree. Walls could not contain kindness, and kindness, once lit, spreads. Even under rule, even beneath stone. People who once bowed before lords began holding each other straighter. They didn't defy, but they didn't break. In one case, a peasant refused to till the lord's new pasture. I buried my daughter here, he said. I will not plow memory. He was beaten, but not silenced. Others placed stones beside the patch, then flowers, then candles, and soon the field was sacred. A lord could not touch it. Even he knew some things are stronger than fear. Words returned too. A traveling weaver began leaving small cloths behind, embroidered with lines. You are seen. The wind knows your name. Let the earth remember. No one claimed them, but they were found in doorways, under pillows, in barns. A new kind of scripture. Not from pulpits, from hands. And songs returned. At first, simple tunes, lullabies, work rhythms, then verses with M, meaning, we till what they don't own. We carry names they forgot. We live where they only rule. Sung softly, but heard deeply. In one town, a group of children began mimicking a trial, not of a thief, of a lord. They played, laughed, acted, but adults watched, and some cried, because in that play was truth, because in that laughter was memory, because in that room no fear entered. A priest in York refused to read one of the king's proclamations. It lacks mercy, he said, and God is not cruel. He was removed. Another took his place, but in the next sermon half the pews were empty. People listened from outside, holding copies of the old priest's words. Not protest, presence. A man in Castile began carving walking sticks, each handle shaped like a face. For the forgotten, he said, to walk with us still. He gave them freely, each found its own path. And slowly, lords began to notice. Taxes delayed, orders questioned. Workers disappeared, then reappeared where they chose. Not in revolt, in quiet migration, in whispered refusal. The church tightened sermons. Obey, they said. The world depends on order. But in kitchens, mothers told different stories, of brave grandmothers, of smart sisters, of cousins who healed with hands, not prayers. And in the telling, another order emerged, not of power, of care, of witness, of resilience. In one fishing town, nets were braided into a circle and laid at the feet of the town square statue, a lord astride a horse. Even fish swim together. Someone had carved on a stone, "Why not we?" No one took credit. But the next morning, the statue was covered in shawls, in scarves, in small tokens. It was no longer just a monument. It was a message, a beginning. Scribes noticed changes in letters. Once, people signed, "Your loyal subject." Now, "Your neighbor." Once, "By your command." Now, "If it is just." And in these small phrases, centuries shifted. It wasn't yet revolt, but it was something. Like a tremor before the quake, like wind before the storm. And if you're resting now, wondering what changes any, know this: it begins here, with a thought, with a whisper, with the courage to see another's pain and still open your hands. In every moment of cruelty, there are people who choose to remain human. And in that choice, history breathes. Some say change comes with banners, but in truth, it begins in silence. In the spaces where silence is broken not by shouts, but by breath held a little less tightly. In the villages where peasants had long bent their backs without question, a strange new thing began to spread. Questions, not shouted in streets, whispered at wells. Why is his bread finer than ours? Why must her child starve while his dog feasts? Who decided this was order? And once asked, such questions do not die. They echo, and each echo awakens someone new. In Kent, a group of young men gathered not with weapons, but with parchment. They copied proclamations by hand, then rewrote them. Same structure, different words. "The king says laborers must not roam," they wrote. "We say the land must feed all. The church says your soul is owned," they wrote. "We say it was never for sale." These weren't scholars. They were sons of thatchers, daughters of shepherds. But their ink stained more than paper it stained time. In one town, an old man kept a journal, just notes, scattered thoughts. "Today, my neighbor fed me. Yesterday, the Lord raised tax again. Tomorrow I will still sing. No one asked to read it, but when he passed, they did. And in those pages, they saw themselves. In Flanders, a midwife began telling stories in rhyme, not fairy tales, truths. She called them songs for sleep, but no child slept through them. They listened, eyes wide, hearts learning. In her words, cruelty had a name, and kindness a face. Her verses spread, crossed valleys, crossed tongues, and became gospel to those forgotten. Somewhere in Lombardy, a boy refused to bow. He did not shout. He did not fight. He simply stood when others knelt. A lord struck him, but others watched. And in time, they too stood, not all at once, but more each time, until bowing felt wrong, until standing felt right. In a town square in Toulouse, a new kind of gathering formed. People brought no banners, just hands, to mend, to share. One brought grain, another cloth, another brought song. They called it Market of the Leftovers, but it became the heart of their town. When a noble tried to ban it, people returned the next day. Then again, until he stopped trying, because the market was no longer just food. It was defiance wrapped in kindness. A woman in Saxony painted tiny symbols on the backs of wooden spoon circles, crosses, stars. When asked, she said, "They are for memory." Each meal, she said, should remember, not the pain, but the choice to survive it. In her symbols, people saw a future written not by kings, but by those who fed each other. Even some clergy changed. A young friar began translating scriptures into the local tongue. They deserve to understand, he said. His elders disagreed, but his sermons filled the chapel, because his words did not demand obedience. They invited hope, the idea that the divine might not live only in cathedrals, but also in bread shared between neighbors. And that was dangerous, because it meant the poor were not cursed, they were sacred. In Prague, someone began carving messages into beams of old barns. We remain. We remember. We rise. No one knew who did it, but they kept appearing. Each market day, new words. Some called it rebellion. Others called it prophecy. But all agreed it made the village feel less alone. A scribe in Avignon began copying these phrases onto scraps, then sending them to nearby towns, wrapped in cloth, hidden in sacks of flour. In one of them he wrote, "Not all fire burns. Some warms, some lights the way." A fire began to warm, in quiet meals, in songs carried by wind, in hands held under tables, in glances exchanged across pews. The kind of fire that doesn't destroy, the kind that softens stone. And in that softening, foundations shifted. For centuries, peasants had lived inside a story not written by them, a story of silence, of servitude, of divine order etched by foreign hands. But now they began to write, in wood, in bread, in voice. And in time their story would spread. The Lord still ruled, the church still thundered, but beneath that thunder was a new pulse, strong, slow, unstoppable, not a revolution, not yet, but a readiness, a quiet gathering of breath, a return of voice. So if you've ever wondered how great change begins, know this. It doesn't start with kings. It starts with you, with the questions you ask, with the kindness you choose, with the truth you carry, even when no one listens. Especially then, because the first story we ever own is the one we whisper to ourselves. And that story, once told with courage, can change everything. When the winds finally shifted and the last carts rolled past, when the fires had burned and the burials were done, Europe stood still. Not in peace. Not yet, but in a kind of breath held too long. The plague had passed, but it had not truly gone. It lingered in empty cribs, in boarded windows, in wells where no one sang. And yet, in this stillness, something began to move, quietly, reluctantly. Life, not the life that had been. Something smaller, humbled, like a child learning to walk again after a fall. In Florence, a painter returned to his wall. The colors felt wrong now. Too bright, too arrogant. So he painted shadows. People bent not in agony, but in thought, hands reaching not for gold, but for each other. He said nothing, but when others saw his work, they felt seen. In a monastery near Lyon, a monk rewrote a prayer, not to beg, but to thank. For the breath I still carry, he wrote, for the sky that still waits, for the chance to kneel without fear. It was short, but it spread, copied, shared, spoken softly at dawn. A different kind of liturgy, one that didn't demand penance, only presence. Fields overgrown began to bloom again, not with wheat first, but with wildflowers, nature's apology. Or perhaps a reminder that she reclaims, yes, but also restores. And peasants, those who survived, began to walk differently. Not boldly, but not bowed. They asked for wages now, not as gifts, as right. And though the lords protested, something had shifted. Too many had died to pretend the old ways still held. In London, a bell tower rang again not for mourning, but for gathering. A baker, a healer, a mason, a widow, they met weekly. No title, no agenda, just to speak. And in speaking, remembered how to belong. In Prague, a child was born with eyes open wide. The midwife said, "She sees beyond." The mother said, "Let her name mean light." They called her Clara. She grew, as did many others, into a world that no longer trusted old certainties. The church still preached, but people began to question, not out of rebellion, out of hunger for meaning, not ritual, for mercy, not fear, for stories that matched what they had lived. A writer in Lübeck began a new kind of tale, not about knights, about grief, about a woman who lost her husband, her children, but still tended to strangers.
"Because they were someone's once,"
she said. The story traveled. People wept. Not because it was sad, but because it was true. In the ruins of a city once filled with plague, someone planted a tree. No plaque, no fence, just roots. Years later, it shaded a bench, a place to sit, to rest, to remember, to imagine. And memory mattered now, not in marble, in murmurs. Families kept stories of those they lost, not as ghosts, as anchors. He was kind. She could sing. They laughed even at the end. And in those stories, love outlasted death. Somewhere in the hills of Castile, a teacher told her students, "The plague ended many lives, but not all futures." She taught numbers, yes, but also silence. How to listen. How to feel the weight of another's pause. That, she said, is where truth lives. Cities rebuilt, slowly, but never the same. Markets reopened. Bells rang again. But always there was a crack in the sound. A reminder. Not of fear, of cost. The cost of forgetting. The cost of believing pain can be erased without listening first. A philosopher wrote, "After death comes wisdom. If we let it, if we look not away but into." He wasn't popular, but his book was kept. And centuries later, someone would find it and say, "He knew." Even art changed. Faces became softer, not idealized, real, wrinkled, tired, alive. Sculptors carved not kings, but mothers. Weavers wove tapestries not of battles, but of meals, of hands, of firelight, of peace. Because peace now was the rarest treasure, and the people who had seen too much knew that it came not from walls or swords, but from choosing not to turn away. Not from suffering, from each other. And you, listening now, lying in the quiet, perhaps you feel that echo, the weight of all that was lost, but also the light of all that survived, the lullabies, the names, the hands that reached out anyway. That is your inheritance. Not fear, not plague, but the fire that did not die, that warmed instead of burned, that stayed when everything else left. So rest now. And if you dream, dream not of kings, but of the woman who fed the stranger, of the boy who stood when all bowed, of the child who saw the world and still smiled. These are the stories worth keeping. These are the stories that healed. Not all wounds bleed. Some settle into the skin of a culture. The Black Death didn't just take lives, it changed words. Before, death had been distant, something for the very old, the very poor, the very far away. But after, it was everywhere. On doorways, in lullabies, in the cracks between prayers. People stopped saying, "If I die." They began saying, "When?" And that changed everything. In Venice, a poet stopped writing about gods. He wrote of bread, of wind, of the shape his wife's hands made when braiding her hair. "Because these," he said, "are the only truths we carry with us when the fever comes." His verses were whispered, memorized, not because they were beautiful, because they were enough. In Paris, a scholar wrote the first known treatise on silence. "It is not the absence of thought," he wrote, "it is the home of it." He argued that not every gap between words is ignorance. Sometimes it is grace. His colleagues mocked him, but his students wrote his ideas into margins, into diaries, into letters, and those whispers outlived the laughter. Across Europe, art grew quieter, loud colors dulled, triumphs faded. In their place, mourning veils, clasped hands, eyes looking not up, but sideways saw as if asking, "Are you still here?" The paintings began to breathe, not preach. Even music shifted. Laments replaced marches, repetition replaced fanfare. Songs looped, like memory, like grief, like hope unwilling to fade. A cathedral in Cologne changed its bells. Their chime now fell in a minor key, a little off, a little human, a little like sorrow learning to speak. The priests said it honored the dead, but others said it reminded the living. The world had tilted, and no chime could right it. In Bruges, a playwright invented a character who never spoke. He simply watched, cried, hugged. On stage, he did nothing, but everyone watched him, because in him, they saw themselves. The ones who had endured, the ones who had no words left. In Krakow, a new phrase appeared, "He walks with shadow." It didn't mean someone was ill. It meant they had survived, but at a cost. And people understood. They offered bread, a nod, a hand on the shoulder. Because now, survival was not victory. It was a burden gently carried. Even law changed. In some cities, beggars were no longer punished. Not because the rulers had grown kind, because they had learned how easily they too might beg. Pity became policy, not from charity, from memory. And memory, once feared, became sacred. Families began keeping books, not of money, of names, of births, of last words. A woman in Marseille kept a list. Jean, who brought apples. Luce, who waited with me when my mother died. A child with a red ribbon, I never learned her name. She read the list every Sunday, and taught her and daughter to do the same. Because forgetting, she said, is how it starts again. Even language bent. New words entered the tongue. Hollow days, for days when grief was heavier than tasks. Ash, light, for the dawns that followed too many nights of weeping. Hold fast, for the friends who stayed. And while these words faded from dictionaries, they never left the heart. The church, though shaken, adapted. Some clerics began preaching not fire, but warmth. "What use is heaven?" one friar asked, "if we do not make earth bearable?" He was exiled, but his words stayed, printed on scraps, tied to trees, painted on stones. And in time, they made their way into sermons, into songs, into law. In Oxford, a philosopher argued that pain itself is knowledge. It teaches what comfort cannot, he said. It reveals what pride conceals. His writings were dense, but his students wept reading them, because in those words they felt seen. And being seen after so much disappearance felt holy. In Seville, a grandmother began giving her grandchildren wooden tokens each, carved with a single line. "Stay kind, be slow, forgive." When asked why, she said, "So they have something to carry when I'm not there." The tokens wore smooth, but the messages held. Because in a world rebuilt on bones, gentleness was treasure. This gentleness, fragile at first, became strength. A shoemaker refused to raise prices, though others did. "They buried my brother," he said. "I will not take from the morning." A tailor offered thread for free. A baker left loaves on windowsills. No one asked why. They remembered, not who died, but how they had felt when death passed by. In Stockholm, someone built a bench with no back, so those who sat could face each other or face away. Choice, they said, is healing, and this bench, though plain, became legend. People came from miles to sit, to say nothing, or everything. To know that someone once thought to leave a place for sorrow to sit down. These weren't revolutions, they were revelations. A slow change, not in power, in posture, in the tilt of heads, the softness of replies. The courage to ask, "Are you okay?" and mean it. In this new world, hope wore different clothes. Less gold, more wool, less thunder, more lullaby. And perhaps, somewhere deep inside, Europe knew it would never be the same. But that was not only loss. That was also a beginning, one shaped not by kings or armies but by the quiet acts of those who had learned the hardest way what it means to remain. And so the world kept turning, slowly, gently, not because it forgot, but because it remembered differently. Not in screams, in whispers, not in monuments, in lullabies. The Black Death faded not from history, but into it, like ink absorbed by old paper, always there, never loud, just present. Like the echo of a bell long after it stops ringing. In a village long gone, someone planted lilacs near a stone. They didn't mark the grave. They didn't speak. But each spring, the blooms returned, pale and fragrant, bending slightly toward the wind. And those who passed by knew someone loved someone here, and love, unlike plague, doesn't vanish. In a market rebuilt where silence once ruled, a woman sold hand-woven scarves, each one a different color, each one tied with a note, for warmth, for memory, for days not yet ruined. She never spoke much, but people came again and again, not just for cloth, for the feeling of being seen by someone who didn't need to ask why. In the hills where smoke once curled from funeral pyres, children played. They didn't know, not fully, but sometimes one would stop, look to the horizon, then keep playing, and their mothers would watch them, eyes wet, because the world had returned, not untouched, but still turning, still singing, just quieter now. In some towns, a new custom began. On certain nights, candles were left in windows not for the dead, but for the living who carried their names. A sign, you are not alone. Someone remembers. The flames flickered, danced, waited, and sometimes a traveler would stop, sit on the steps, rest their head against the door, just for a moment, just to feel less ghost, more human. A scribe in Bologna once wrote, "The plague taught us the cost of forgetting." So he wrote everything, not just facts, feelings. Today, I wept when a bird landed on the windowsill. I thought it would leave. It stayed. He wrote that. And centuries later, someone read it. And wept too. Because truth, when spoken simply, never expires. In a monastery no longer standing, a hymn was written with only one word, stay, sung again and again, until it became breath, until it became prayer, until it became silence. Because sometimes staying is the bravest thing. In that silence, something holy lived, not in churches, in kitchens, in gardens. In the act of placing a hand on a shoulder without asking first, in the pause between, "Are you okay?" and the answer. In the decision to listen, even when it hurt, especially when it hurt. That was the inheritance the Black Death left behind. Not riches, not revenge, but awareness of breath, of time, of each other. And for those willing to carry it, the world was not darker, only deeper. In old age, survivors often sat by fires without speaking. They stared into the flames, not out of fear but out of knowing. knowing that the worst had come, that it could come again, that it always might, but also knowing that warmth, however small, could still be made, could still be shared, even from ashes, especially from ashes. A widow once whispered to her granddaughter, "When the world ends, light a candle, not to fight the dark, but to welcome the next world kindly." The girl didn't understand, not then, but she lit candles every year after, just in case. In books rarely opened, a note was found. If you are reading this, then you are alive. And if you are alive, remember the quiet ones, the ones who stayed, the ones who fed others even as they starved. Remember not just how they died, but how they lived, even at the edge. The page smelled of smoke, but the ink still held, like a promise not meant to be broken. And now, centuries later, you lie here, listening, not because you seek horror, but because you seek understanding of what it meant, of what it means, to live through something that changes everything, and keep going anyway. So let the quiet hold you. Let the names rest on your chest, not as weight but as reminder, that you are part of something older than pain, older than plague, older than death. You are part of the story that chose to continue, that chose to soften, not harden, to sing, not silence, to hold, not hoard. And that is not weakness. That is survival, not of the body, of the spirit. So sleep now. Let the echoes pass through you, not around you. Let the names fade, not from memory, but into peace. You are here. That is enough. That is everything.